I'm going to introduce Mahmoud, who is another participant of our panel. She, from refugee to Yale to world champion poet, now Goodwill ambassador, Emtithal Mahmoud. Actually, you may want to go forward to watch this because this is so special. She advocates for the cause of refugees through her poetry and in her incredible experience. In 2017, she hosted the fully inclusive civilian peace talks across Sudan as part of her One Girl Walk and Dreams for Peace initiative. In 2018, she completed an unprecedented 620-mile walk in 30 days from Darfur to Khartoum, mobilizing thousands of people along the way. As The Guardian put it, she has, quote, debated with presidents, been comforted by the Dalai Lama, has been called one of the most inspiring women, but it's really the poet in her that truly shines. And so Stanford Global Health and Johns Hopkins Global Now want to share this gift with you. Emmy.
This first poem is called People Like Us, and it's about where I'm from, and then I'll just dive into it, okay? Memories of my childhood live between the rings of sand around my ankles and the desert heat in my lungs. I still believe that nothing washes worry from tired skin better than the Nile and my grandma's hands. Every day, I go to school with the weight of dead neighbors on my shoulders. The first time I saw bomb smoke, it didn't wind and billow like the heat from the kitchen hearth, but it forced itself against the Darfur sky, smothering the sun with tears that it stole from our bodies. The worst thing about genocide isn't the hunger, the murder, the politics, the government-paid soldiers that chase you across borders and into camps. It's the silence. For 3 months, they closed the schools down because people like us are an eyesore. So the first month, we took it. The second, we waited. And the third month, we met underneath the date palm trees, drinking up every second our teachers gave us, turning fruit pits into fractions. On the last day, they came with a message, put them in their place. We didn't stand a chance. Flesh was never meant to dance with silver bullets, so we prayed for the sun to come and melt daggers from our backs. I hid underneath the bed that day with 4 other people. 12 years later, and I can't help but wonder where my cousins hid when the soldiers torched the houses, threw the bodies in the wells. So if the weapons didn't get you, the poison would, and sometimes they didn't want to use bullets because it would cost them more than we did. What does it matter? I've seen 16 ways to stop a heart when you build nations on someone's bones. What sense does it make to break them? In one day, my mother choked on rifle smoke. My father washed the blood from his face. My uncles carried half the bodies to the hospital and the rest to the grave, and we watched. For every funeral we planned, there were 60. We couldn't have the sand in the Sahara. It tastes a lot like powdered bone. And when the soldiers came, our blood on their ankles, I remember their laces. Scarlet footprints on the floor. I remember waking to the sound of hushed voices in the night, etched with the kind of sorrow that turns even the loudest dreams to ash. Our parents came home with broken collarbones and the taste of fear carved into their skin, and it was impossible to believe in anything. Fear is the coldest thing in the desert, and it burns you, bows you down to half your height, and owns you, and no one hears you, because what could grow in the desert anyway? Thank you. I get really nervous, and it's very hard to talk about sometimes, but I feel like this is exactly the space where I'd feel comfortable talking about it. I wrote that poem my first year of college, and it was about an incident that happened when I was about 7 years old, but it was really about the entire war. In the middle of that poem, I was 7 and hiding under the bed in the middle of Darfur, like hoping that my mom would come home, not knowing what would come next. And then 15 years after that moment, I was the closing speaker at my Yale graduation. And when I think about how time changes things, or when I think about what it is that helps us get through any given moment, I think about the different people that influenced my life. And today I want to talk to you about how I bring those people into the room with me wherever it is that I go now. The crazy thing that I never really get to mention is that when I was 7 years old in the year 2000 and this was happening, I was on summer vacation from Indiana, I was on summer vacation, and then I had to go and start second grade after that summer. Yeah. So what I do now is I use my experience and my knowledge to create ideas that move people with a dash of poetry. And a lot of times what that looks like is it looks like me being usually the only Black woman, Afro-Arab, Muslim person in the room, young person usually, trying to convince a lot of people who have nothing to do with what I'm talking about to care about people that I personally know. And sometimes what it looks like is it looks like me talking to a few young kids, trying to tell them about something that I learned about when I was 10 without traumatizing them from life. But that is one of my favorite spaces to work in with the younger children. I'll tell you what those spaces have to do with each other. So I want to tell you a story about these adorable little girls I talked to in Sharjah in the UAE. It was a science classroom. It was a science and technology classroom, all young girls, ages 7 to 9 years old. I was there for a book festival talking about my first book, and it was in October. And they say to me, okay, so we need you to tell them about genocide. I'm like, oh, 7 to 9-year-olds? Okay, I can handle that. Because I had done it before for different age groups in South Africa and in India, but the difference was that these girls, they reminded me a lot of me when I was around that age. And when, I was speaking to them in Arabic and English, but I'll tell you guys the story in English. So I said to them, all right, let's say somebody bullies you in class. What would you do? Somebody raised their hand and said, I'd tell them to stop. I was like, good. What if they don't stop? They said, okay, I'll tell the teacher. I said, all right, let's say you go to the teacher and you say, so-and-so is bullying me. But the teacher says, oh, they're bullying you? I'm going to bully you too. At this point, the girls' eyes just go wide. They're like, what? I said, yes, the teacher says she's going to bully you too. What are you going to do then? They said, I'll tell my parents. So somebody raises their hand and says, I'm going to tell my parents. I say, okay, you and your parents go to the teacher and you say, this kid is bullying me. And the teacher says, oh, they're bullying you? I'm going to bully you and your parents. At this point, the kids are freaking out, not knowing what to say because I'm ruining all sense of order that they have. Because at that age, the only thing they understand about the world is this is what order looks like. So they say, okay, we're going to go to the principal. I said, all right. You go to the principal says, I'm going to bully you and your parents. And they say, oh my God, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? They say, we're going to go to the director. He's in on it too. We're going to go to the police. They're in on it too. And at this point, the girls are just like throwing their notebooks down, saying they don't know what to do. And finally, they keep going until they reach the president. And I say, what if I told you the president said he's going to bully you too? And they said, I don't know what I would do. So I asked them, like, what would you do? And they say, I would run. I said, where would you go? They said, I would leave. I'd go anywhere but there. And I said, okay, but what would happen? Like, what if they follow you? They said, I'd keep running until I reach somewhere, anywhere but there. And I said, okay, but what if nobody believes you? And they said, well, I'm going to speak up. And I said, what if no one hears you? They said, I'm going to speak up until somebody hears me. And that's always the beautiful point that the kids reach to. And I tell them, that's what happened in my country. And the thing that is really hard for me is that usually when I get to that point, the kids, at least one of them will raise their hand and they say, like, my parents left too from wherever it is that they were at. So the thing that I learned from those little girls is that they have a lot in common with, I guess, like the Silicon Valley people that I usually talk to, or like the presidents in the room, whoever it is. A lot of them, they'll start out not knowing what a refugee is. But if you talk to somebody and you ask them and you put them in that position, then they'll start to talk about their human instinct. But sometimes, even that human instinct to speak up and to do something about it isn't enough, which is what brings me to this next poem. This is called For Muhammad, Taha, and Adam. And I'm sorry if I'm talking really fast. It just happens when I'm nervous. This is called For Muhammad, Taha, and Adam. And I wrote it about two of my cousins and their friend who were killed in 2016 in Indiana after leaving Sudan, after they made it to safety. It was a hate crime, and the thing that it was hard for me is I found out the news my senior year, a month after sitting with President Obama. and I'll tell you at the end of the poem what I learned from that. Okay. Still would love to have him back, just saying. I walk into the morgue. The mortician presents my country splayed across a table. Asks me to identify the body. I do not recognize it. Its emaciated form dimmed by a death I did not prepare for. I did not expect losing my culture to feel like this. This cadaver I dared to call an identity once held the belief that I could hold home on the tip of my tongue, in the breadth of my appetite, in the weight of my memories. I only recognize my country in photographs, in tour books, in sepia, not in living color, not in the state of surrender. My stomach failed me first, gripping down on processed food, the bite of bile on my disobedient tongue. My ears followed, forgetting the timbre of my grandfather's voice, the swift hush of wind over desert sand. Then my accent, as they force-fed me this borrowed language. There's something about the taste of assimilation that makes you want to get back in the boat. I think of home each time the bank asks me if I want to go paperless. Don't they know that people of color have been doing that since before Plymouth Rock? Since Underground Railroad? Since my uncles turning my house into a refugee camp? Don't they know red, white, and blue? Like stand your ground, like hate crimes, like shoot to kill? Only stars I see are when the cops roll in to take my family, my neighborhood, undocumented. Only stripes I see chain us to this prison of an existence. I find myself talking to people across borders more each day. I find myself crying for their countries too. This massacre, this wilted flower field of gutted nations, less melting pot, more guillotine, more disemboweled American dream. If you hate it so much, then why are you here? Because sometimes the buildings collapse, but the rubble keeps bleeding. Because sometimes your blood is the only thing you can carry with you. Because sometimes the water is more inviting than where you stand. And that's how you end up with little kids washed up on foreign soil. And I'm not just talking about the ones that make it. Do you know what it's like to escape genocide only to be gunned down in your own home? Don't they know that they're just finishing the work that our dictators started? Ever since they handed me the death certificate, no. The certificate of naturalization. I've been seeing ghosts, mostly in the mirror, at the dinner table, at the family picnic. We were naive enough to believe that we could hold home and here without anyone having to leave. I met the president, sat with him at a table too small to hold all the things that brought us there. His hands resting. Where are your chains? They told me your hands were tied. When they sent those kids back, when they wouldn't take the refugees, when they closed down the borders but not Guantanamo, Mr. President, why do they call it the land of the free when even the dead can't leave? Mr. President, what does one caged bird say to another? I couldn't hear him over the sound of the corpse lying between us. He looked at me as if he thought I were afraid. Doesn't he know that back home, the women take care of the bodies? Thank you. So I wrote that poem in between two meetings with one of my heroes. But the thing is, at the first meeting, it was like 10 people at the first visit to a mosque by President Obama as a sitting president, and my friend Suzanne Barakat was there, and her brother and two of her family members had been killed the year before in another hate crime that is still to this day labeled a parking incident. And so for me, I realized that there is a buffer between when you speak truth to power and when power reacts. And even when power reacts immediately, there's always a lot of people who are missing that action in the middle. So in that buffer zone between when you reach the people you need to reach and when the people you really need to reach are actually reached, that's where I exist. That's where a lot of us exist, and that's where change can actually happen, in that zone between people. And so a lot of times, women fall into that category, into that buffer zone. I never get to explain what the last line of my poem came from, that back home, the women take care of the bodies. Specifically in that year, I'd been thinking about how we handled the Ebola crisis and how they found out that, because the women were taking care of the bodies as they do in most places, they were also getting sick quicker than anybody else. And so it made me think about what it is, what our place is as people who try to prevent erasure and try to help people. And medicine has always been the answer to me, global health and medicine in general. Because when I was little, I remember saying, oh yeah, people will lie to you, but these cells, they're never going to lie to you. I was a really weird kid. I was very strange. But for me, it was realizing that doctors and are definitely on the front line, but they're also the final line as well. They're the last line of defense. Because between when a conflict starts and when it ends, there are people who die and there are people who get hurt. When the people get hurt, the first people to try and help them are the people they go to for help. So usually the health professionals. Those are the first people that were targeted in Sudan when my family had to leave. So my dad was a doctor and my mom a medical lab technician. And my dad, he was brought the body of his friend who worked with him. And, they started voicing their opinions about what the government was doing wrong. And they said to him, tell us he died of malaria, right? And my dad refused. He said no, because he was clearly tortured and killed. And so then they gave him another test, and they said, okay, we're going to bury him. He said no, put him on ice until the pathologist can do an actual examination. And then, we received the notice that it's probably good to leave. I'll tell that other story a different day. But the reality is that after my dad was gone, health professionals were targeted even more. And many death certificates are forged, and you're told either you say that this person died of natural causes or you're going to die of not natural causes. And so what you learn about this is that even after a person dies, there's the bodies speak and the bones speak, and there's still a record of what actually happened. So I see doctors and I see you guys as the record keepers, and I see what you do as not just the first line, but the last line of defense. Because when we fail to preserve life, we still can succeed in making sure that it's not erased. So erasure is something that I think can be fought even after death. And that's what I said to the kids when they said to me, before they reach the point where they say that I'm going to speak until somebody hears me. Some of the kids say, I'm going to give up. And I tell them, no, don't give up. I'll tell you why you don't give up. So in the end, I ask them, who said they're going to give up? And some people raise their hands. And I say, okay, if you give up, how will anyone know that you were here? And the kids just freeze and they say, wow, no one will know. And I said, well, that's why you don't give up. And the beauty of it is those kids, they just had it in them, the will to speak, to talk about it, to try and solve these problems. And when I work with different age groups, I always see that from a very young age until a certain point, everyone has that natural instinct to try and speak up when something is wrong, to try and do something, try and solve it. I don't know where in our development that we lose that. I don't know where it is that people lose that instinct, but I know that it's something cultural and it's a global culture that we can actually change. And that's why I think this could be the new offensive of medicine, just people actually talking about it. Because the reality is that when people think of health professionals, they think of credibility and they think of authenticity. And you have the unique ability to actually talk about something and be seen as talking about it objectively, no matter what you say. And that can be misused, Dr. Oz. But if we use it correctly, we can actually do something really beautiful with it. I'm going to leave you with this last poem. And the reason that I'm really ardent about this is because in January, I was going through something horrible because I was in Sudan in December and November, and then the protests started, which are still going on right now. But as soon as I left, because I was told, you're an influencer, you need to leave immediately. They're targeting influencers, and you'll be more used to us outside. I left, and I came home, and 2 weeks after I left, I find out that my baby cousin, who was 15 years old, was shot and killed in the protests in January. And it just devastated me because, sometimes I feel a lot of hope doing the work that I do, thinking that maybe we're actually finally reaching everyone that we need to reach. But the reality is we can't do it alone. And I always talk about the urgency of the situation because, I'm still losing people every day. But sometimes it's hard to get that point across. which is why I think it's important to bring people into the room. This poem I actually wrote in 2013, however, and it's crazy to me that it's still relevant today. I wrote it in 2013, my sophomore year, when my brother was shot in similar protests in Sudan, but he survived. But my cousin did not survive. So the reality is, as I grew older, I started seeing these struggles in a different way. Because when you're a child, you're depending on your parents or your cousin or whoever it is to get you out of it. But as I became an adult, I found there were people depending on me. So I think it's really important to understand that we're in 2019 right now, and we need more people who will see these struggles to completion. I've grown up in this struggle, and I'm a product of it, and now I'm lucky enough to try and solve it. So I hope you'll join me in that. This poem I wrote in 2013, and it's still relevant, and I'm going to dedicate it to my cousin Muhammad, who was shot and killed. And I do remember seeing the photograph of him at the morgue. Our family sent it to us because we have a lot of health professionals in the family. And I remember the first two things my dad said was, one, he said, "Oh, there's no blood." And I said, "Oh, that means his heart stopped immediately." And we both sat for a second and said, "So he didn't suffer." But we didn't know that it was him until one of our uncles went to the morgue. Because we saw all over the news and all over the social media that there was a kid that was killed and people were carrying him. And finally we received the news that it's our kid. And the thing is, I cried for the kid in the video before I knew he was my brother. And so we put the pictures away and we sat down and we just mourned for about a month. And I'm still mourning now, but I came out of it thinking, we're going to get them. We're going to do something. So this poem is called Bullets, and I hope it inspires you as much as the people that I try and bring into the room have inspired me. And try to remember that you guys are the final line and also the first line, if that makes sense. So, and I hope to join you someday. I'm taking the MCAT soon. So, yeah. Cool. My father's voice yanks me awake. My brother had been shot. Waiting for that first breath on the other side of the line at a hospital half a world away. I'd never felt fear like that. The thing we'd been fighting for the past 11 years had reached the capital and burrowed itself into my next of kin. I'm 21 years old. 25 now. I'm 21 years old. And I know more about death than about living. My life experiences revolve around massacres and funerals. I know how to start revolutions, but I don't know how to lose myself. I don't know how to give in to this thing called youth because I know how it ends. My brother calls me an idiot, and I call my brother an idiot, and he says, live free or die. He says, freedom is a question of life. If you do not reach for it, then you're not alive. This distinct flavor of anarchy stinks of murder, stains like the blood of a good patriot, and leaves a bitter thirst in your mouth only quenched by liberation. That night, burning cities made me feel numb. Bullets made me think of my brother, so I closed my eyes and I dreamt of lead, of gutted window panes, of Damascus, of Darfur, of Gaza, of Baltimore, and when I awoke, breathing made me feel guilty, makes me feel guilty, like I should have been there, like I should have fought, like I should have stood and faced the firing squad. When you fight for freedom, you stomach pain like that. This body should be lined with bullets, one for each of my brothers and sisters who stopped a bullet for me, but it is the mark of our generation. We are more accustomed to the weight of Molotov cocktails on our bodies than we are to the embrace of one another, but I don't want to live like that. Live free or die free or live. I want to wake up in a time where civil disobedience is an end in death, where children aren't born under the full moon of revolution, where I haven't lost more people than there are years in my life. This changes you. Not in some earth-moving, groundbreaking kind of way, but bit by bit and with incredible stillness. It's the little things. Like how I cringe at the word protest. Like how I don't trust anyone who isn't fighting. Like how I am as accustomed to sleeping bodies as I am to dead ones, because it's all the same. My brother hears me frowning through the phone. He says, smile. You'll live longer. Thank you.